This is the 3-2 podcast, and the podcast here is going to be on energy flow. We're going to talk about how energy moves through two organisms from one to another. And the question that we first key to this chapter, the first question we have to ask is, where does the energy for life processes come from? And the first kind of organism we're going to talk about is a producer. This is the first section of this chapter. So energy has to come into the system that is our Earth. It can't, we're not going to burn coal or something to get energy. We have to have energy coming from the outside. And without it, living systems are not going to be able to function. So the source of this energy is the sun. Sunlight is the main energy source for life on Earth. If you were to look at any process or any place you get energy from, it all is going to go back to sunlight. And the classic example is, how did you get to school today? You drove in a car or a bus. How did the bus run? Well, it ran on gasoline. Where'd that gasoline come from? Well, it came from under the ground. It came from oil deposits under the ground, which at one time were living organisms like plants or dinosaur or whatever that died millions and millions of years ago, was then buried underground and over time turned into oil. And the question then is, well, where did that, let's say the plant, where did the plant get its energy from? And it got its energy from the sun. If it was a dinosaur, let's say, where did that dinosaur get its energy from? Well, it may very well have eaten a plant. Where did it get it? Where did that plant get its energy from? The sun. So you can see that all energy on this Earth basically can be pretty much attributed back to the sun. So there are some organisms in other ecosystems that get their energy from something other than sunlight, and they will get that from energy stored in inorganic chemical compounds. So let's move on. Let's look at look at some of these organisms in more detailed focus here. We're talking about plants, algae, and bacteria can capture energy from the sun and use that energy to produce food. And you probably know the process that we're talking about. We call these organisms autotrophs. And the autotrophs use the energy from the environment around, which might be sunlight, for instance, and use that to create simple inorganic compounds. Take the simple organic compounds, make complex organic compounds. This one right here, it happens to be maltose, which is a carbohydrate. And they're able to take simple inorganic compounds, and you'll see things like water and oxygen and carbon dioxide, and turn them into things that can be useful for life. And they can combine and recombine these organic molecules to produce living tissues such as skin or organs. These organisms make their own food. They produce their own food. So they're called producers. And plants are the producer you're probably most commonly familiar with. And what they're doing is they're harnessing solar energy, and here's the important word right here, photosynthesis. What happens is the organism takes in light energy, and they take in also carbon dioxide and use that light, the energy from the sunlight, to convert carbon dioxide and water into energy-rich carbohydrates, like we said before. And they also release, as a waste product of it, oxygen, which we use to breathe in and use energy. So photosynthesis, without photosynthesis, we're not going to get a supply of oxygen, and also the atmosphere will be filled with carbon dioxide. And here you can see the equation for photosynthesis, which we'll study in more detail in a future chapter. So plants are the main autotrophs on land, but there are other ones. We have algae, and here's a picture of some algae right here. And we also have photosynthetic bacteria, and these are found in tidal flats and salt marshes. You can see that mostly plants are dry, and the algae and the photosynthetic bacteria we find in wet environments. Now, what if there is no light? And unfortunately, this picture is really small, but you're going to see a couple of other big pictures of the same system. If you don't have light, what they do is they use chemical energy to produce carbohydrates in a process called chemosynthesis. And right here is a picture of chemosynthesis occurring. And we'll talk more about what we see in that picture in a minute. What they do is they take hydrogen sulfide and oxygen, and which are combined into a sulfur compound, and that has chemical energy with it. And what the cells do is take the carbon dioxide from water, and using the chemical energy here, they can recombine it into carbohydrates. And this is a picture of a what they call deep sea vent. I'll show you a couple photographs of it. And out of here is basically what's venting out of here is the hydrogen sulfide from deep within the earth. Here's a picture of a vent community right here. You can see here are the vents here, and here are the plants that are undergoing chemosynthesis, bacteria, I'm sorry. And there's still another picture just of the vent. You can see here's the arm from a robotic deep sea submarine. And these things, and that brings up the point here, is this is in a very remote place on Earth, volcanic vents that are deep within the ocean floor. And you can find others along tidal marshes along the coastline, but the ones that are really spectacular are the ones in the volcanic vents. Now let's go on to the next animal. If you can't make your own energy, then you consume somebody else's energy, and that brings up the consumers. This is the second big section in this chapter. They can't take the energy from the physical environment, so what they do is they rely on other organisms for their energy, and these are called heterotrophs, as opposed to an autotroph, which produces its own energy. And here you can see a picture. Here's a producer, and the mouse right here will eat the producer, and then a snake would then eat that first consumer, which we call primary consumer, and then say a hawk would then eat the snake. And what we have here is a food chain, which we'll revisit in a few minutes. And these three taken right here are all consumers. They rely on another organism for their energy. Some eat producers, some eat other consumers. And once again, heterotrophs and consumers are essentially the same word. So many different types of heterotrophs. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores eat animals. Omnivores eat both in plants, and I would place us as omnivores. And detritivores feed on plant and animal remains and other dead matter. I would say we're probably looking at a vulture, say. And then we also have decomposers, which I forgot to mention on the other slide, bacteria and fungi. And what they do is they break down organic matter. They're not necessarily eating dead organisms, but they do decomposers will break down dead organisms. How does energy flow through living systems? Well, we're talking, here's the next big section. We're talking about feeding relationships. And the relationships that we're talking about lead to these feeding networks, and we'll look at a couple different types based on who eats who. And this is now we're referring back to the food chain. Here's the general key to this, is that energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction. It usually starts with the sun or other inorganic compounds, think their thermal vent. It goes to the autotrophs, and then the autotrophs are then eaten by the heterotrophs, in other words, the consumers. Here's one you've seen before, a food chain. And a food chain is just a series of steps in which organisms eat each other and are eaten, and in the process, they're transferring energy. This is the food chain we showed before, with the producer being eaten by the primary consumer, being eaten by the secondary consumer, eaten by the tertiary consumer. And when all these guys die, or when whatever's left of them lies around, then they're taken care of by the decomposers. And once the decomposers take care of that, the nutrients then can be recycled back into the producer. Here's a simple food chain. It starts with algae, which is eaten by zooplankton, which is eaten by small fish, which is eaten by the squid, which is eaten by the shark. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 steps until the shark gets the energy. Remember, the algae probably underwent photosynthesis, and it took 1, 2, 3, 4 steps for that energy from photosynthesis to get to the shark. Now, it's not so simple as a chain. We have what's called food webs, which is much more complex interactions. It's linking all these food chains together in an ecosystem. And the reason they can do that is because a lot of organisms feed on 2 or 3 other different types of organisms. For instance, this hawk right here, not only does he eat this bird, it can also eat the shrew or eat this mouse. The mouse, in turn, can eat from several other different organisms, several different other plants, other producers. So now we're starting to see all kinds of multiple arrows leading from or leading to each of these different organisms. Trophic levels. Trophic levels show the steps in a food chain or food web. It's called a trophic level. And at the bottom of the trophic level are the producers. They're the first trophic level. And then consumers make up all the other steps of the trophic of the food chain or the food web. And each of these consumers below depend on the organisms. Consumers on top depend on the organisms below them for their energy. So, for instance, these rats depend on these plants for energy. Now, here's a question: how efficient is the transfer of energy among organisms in an ecosystem? They represent it with by ecological pyramid. And here's the last section of our chapter is on ecological pyramids. An ecological pyramid is a diagram that shows the relative amounts of energy or matter contained within each trophic level in a food chain or a food web. Now notice there are 2 things here. We're talking about energy or matter. You'll see there are a couple different types of pyramids. So here are the 3 different types. You have energy pyramids, which show energy; biomass, which shows the total amount of matter within that trophic level. For instance, if you take all the rats and put them all on a scale together, that would be their total biomass. and then also pyramids of numbers, which counts the number of individuals. Here's an energy pyramid, and it shows the relative amount of energy available at each trophic level. And the point here is that in a pyramid, only part of that energy is passed on. And as you can see, as they go on, you'll see there's 100% here, but there's only 10% here. And then there's only 1% here, which is also 1/10 of 10%. And then you'll see there's 0.1%, which is 1/10 of 1%. So you can see that every time it goes up a trophic level, only 10% of the energy is available to the next level. So the more levels that exist between a producer and a top-level consumer in an ecosystem, the less energy that remains from the original amount. And here's that number again, 10% or less available energy. That means from the producers down to this consumer down here, you're going to lose 10% from the sun to the plant, then 10% from the plant to the rabbit, then, I'm sorry, you're going to only have 10% from the plant to the rabbit, and then only have 10% of that amount available to the hawk. So the magic number here is 10% of the energy available within one trophic level is transferred to organisms on the next trophic level. Now let's go back to the biomass pyramid. The biomass pyramid set is the total amount of living tissue, and usually it's expressed in terms of grams, which is, you know, if you put them all on a scale, that would be measuring the mass of the organic matter. And the biomass pyramid represents food available for each trophic level in an ecosystem. And you can see once again that the most biomass in an ecosystem is going to be on the bottom with the producers, and the next, and as you go up, you usually have 10% of the biomass with each level up in the pyramid. Now here's pyramid of numbers, and what this shows is the relative number of individual organisms at each trophic level. And you can see that there's a lot of grass and a lot of flowers here, and then as you go up from the trophic level, those that would feed on the grass, such as the mice and the rabbits, there's less of them, less numbers of them, and then the snakes, which would feed on the rabbits and the mice, there's even less of them, and then there's only one hawk that would feed on the snakes. Now sometimes the shape of the pyramid is usually the same as that of the energy in the biomass pyramids, but in some cases there are ecosystems where there are fewer producers than there are consumers, and an example of that is usually when you're dealing with a tree. Now here are two pyramids of numbers that are an example of that. There's only one willow tree, and that would be down at the bottom of it because the caterpillars depend on the willow tree, and the birds depend on the caterpillars, and then the raptors, which is like a bird, depends on the small birds. So it might be one raptor associated with one tree, but in between there, the other steps of the trophic level, there might be more individuals. Here's another example where you have an oak tree. Caterpillars depend on the oak tree. Blackbirds depend on the caterpillars. A buzzard depends on the blackbirds. And that was a very long section. There was a lot to it, but I think this chapter is pretty well structured, so it's going to be pretty easy to follow it. And I encourage you, once again, when you go to do this, look through the chapter before you go ahead writing notes, and write down the big section headings that are usually listed in blue or green, you know, and they're in big bold letters at the top. And once again, there were 4 sections to this, so you can start with that with your notes. Let's take the quiz very quickly here.